Now, for this session, we have a different format from the panels that we've had so far over the last couple of days, which I think all of us have been there or dropped into some of them. In that we have a standalone presentation from researchers at DVARA, and the context of that invitation is that I when I was last in Mumbai, immediately before the outbreak of the pandemic, I had time to go and visit their offices and talk about the research they're doing on financial inclusion, which is an area that I've been interested in for a few years now. And I thought some of the projects that they're involved in on the ground, on the grassroots of digital transactions and kind of everyday life is really important and compelling, and would be really a useful input into the formulation, not just of policy regimes in the future, but also of understanding the kind of potentials and challenges of these kind of changes and the potentials of the applications in play. And of course, we began the event with a kind of high-level discussion, from investors, from app designers, from the kind of from banking transaction specialists about the kind of larger vision of digital transactions in India. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to see here some really kind of tangible, evidence of digital transactions in daily life in India, and how that has been progressing for different groups of people over the last few years. So if I'll hand over to you guys, and I'll thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Srikara, and thank you so much, Adrian, for inviting us first and giving us this platform to kind of present our findings. In this presentation, as you know, we'll be talking about women's mobile phone access and use patterns in India. And in the presentation, what we attempt to do is really kind of put together the different studies and research projects we've undertaken in the past 2 years or so to understand how it is that the more vulnerable groups of our society are accessing something that's otherwise booming in the country or appears to be booming in the country. Next slide, please, Srikara. So our conversation over the next hour will really just first be a context about the Future of Finance initiative itself. This is where my colleague Srikara and I have been working for the past 2 to 3 years. Then we're going to set some context about women and digital payments in India. And serial numbers 3 to 5 are really just our findings from the projects that we've undertaken. So we're going to talk about usage patterns of mobile phones and digital payments by women in India, the kind of constraints, socio-cultural, technical, infrastructural that women face in using mobile phones and digital payments, and finally kind of end it off with some research questions or thinking ahead thoughts for researchers and policymakers and providers. So if I could just start with the project that we work for. We work for the Future of Finance initiative, which is one of the 4 initiatives that are part of DVARA Research. DVARA Research itself is a not-for-profit research institution that's part of the larger DVARA Holdings group. And DVARA Holdings really, their key business is hosting and running microfinance institutions in the rural areas of a couple of Indian states. And really, that's where a kind of mandate to serve the low-income individual, the low-income households at the last mile comes from. So just in the case of Future of Finance initiative, we seek to address new challenges for policy and regulation around consumer protection, given all the waves of digital innovation that have been sweeping retail financial services, especially since 2016, which was when the landmark policy move of demonetization had happened in the second half. And while digital movement towards digital payments in India was happening, it wasn't as spurred as it did right after that move became, because that's when we started to see a spike in the kind of adoption of digital payments, mobile money by a lot of people in India. So given that we study kind of the consumer protection issues and other kind of issues that come up at the intersection of finance and technology, we bifurcate our research in 3 research themes, which you can see on the screen right now. The first being disintermediation of financial services. So we know how retail finance used to work till a certain point of time, and ever since the digitization has occurred or has been occurring, there has been a proliferation of entities which are now disintermediating financial services and interacting with users of retail finance in a manner that is very different from before. So where earlier a customer could or a consumer could just go to a brick and mortar branch to kind of undertake any kind of financial services. Now there is a host of services, a host of front ends that they can access to kind of undertake the same activity. The second is public infrastructure and digital finance. So here we talk about, and we like to think about kind of the different infrastructures that are being facilitated and are being created to almost enable digital financial services and to enable the use of mobile phones, etc. And here, when we talk about large public infrastructures or digital finance, what we've been looking at are Aadhaar and India Stack, which were kind of the initial contenders of large infrastructure, which is what enabled kind of identity mapping and a lot of digital payments in India. But more so, as we've been moving forward in India, we've seen the proposals of things like public credit registries, which was the central bank's proposal of creating a data warehouse of all the financial data that exists. In operation right now are also account aggregators, the idea of which was to kind of aggregate all the financial information that a user could have and kind of use that to ease how people are accessing financial services. And finally, our third theme is consumer data and advanced analytics. Now, with the coming of kind of digital services, we know that currency is also people's personal data. So we want to see how it is that this data is being used, how it's being protected by providers and the state alike. So really our vision, which is very similar to the larger vision of DVARA Holdings itself, is that every individual have universal access to suitable financial services using a range of channels that enable them to transact securely and confidently. Next slide, please, Srikara. So very quickly, we want to be a strong and credible voice for research that leads from the consumer protection on technology and financial services. So we really want to kind of focus on the issues that consumers are facing, both existing and the new ones that come from these waves of digitization. And therefore, our primary audience, as you will see on the right side of screen, are policymakers and researchers, because we do feel that our research is best kind of at a position to make impact when it is the policymakers and researchers of a country that kind of are able to incorporate that research into their thinking for policy and make changes for our primary stakeholder, which you will see on the top, which is the low income and excluded households. And our secondary audience also are industry and service providers, because given that we do come from the consumer protection angle, we do want to take into account how it is that providers are operating within the space. And we, instead of kind of being an opposing voice, we want to be a collaborative voice to kind of see how it is that they are designing their products. So next slide, please, Shika. Now, just very quickly on context for women and digital payments in India itself. Next slide. So first, I think is just a comment on the number of digital payments, the volume itself of digital payments. And here we're talking about everything from UPI, which is the Unified Payments Interface, to NEFT, RTGS, etc. These have and we're also including government transfers in these, which are really government to citizen transfers that have taken place over the last year. They've reached 4,275 million in May 2021. This is almost a 67% increase in volume from the same time last year. But this data is not gender disaggregated, which is also something that we've been thinking about. Then the number of women who own and operated bank accounts in different states ranges between 63 to 90% according to a national household survey. Then women account for more than half of the 400 and almost 420 million beneficiaries of bank accounts under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, wherein the government themselves had incentivized and kind of mandated for all citizens to have bank accounts, which were really no-frill, very basic accounts, did not require any maintenance fees. So despite women having more than half of these bank accounts, we do see very high rates of dormancy and inoperation in these bank accounts. Just kind of the Jan Dhan Yojana that I was talking about is also part of the JAM Trinity, which was introduced by the current government. The JAM Trinity is really Jan Dhan accounts, which are the mandated bank accounts, the Aadhaar, which we were just speaking about, which is like a national identity system, and finally mobile phones. And the idea for this Trinity to have taken place and mandated was to allow beneficiaries to conduct digital transactions through their mobile phones, and also kind of provide the enabling prerequisite infrastructure for all the kind of digital payments and digital transfers that the government's been kind of wanting to move to. And finally, just a comment on kind of women in urban India. 2/3 of urban Indian women seem to use digital payments through mobile phones, payment cards, where we're talking about really debit cards, and internet banking quite regularly. But again, this number is quite minuscule if you were to look at it as a larger percentage of total women in India. Next slide, please. So given all of this context, there does seem to be like a mixed image of what is going on with respect to digital payments and use of mobile phones by women. But we also very regularly see anecdotal evidence about the kind of challenges that women face in using mobile phone-based financial services, but also just the mobile phone device itself. And therefore, in the past 2 years, we've been wanting to really explore these anecdotes and find more concrete evidence that can enable evidence-based policy making in the country. And so we've really undertaken 3 key projects, findings of which we're going to be talking about over the next kind of 40 minutes. The first one is really about understanding mobile access and use of mobile phones. And this is kind of a survey of about 60 women from low-income households. And this is like a key survey that we're going to be talking about, but we'll also kind of append it with 2 other findings. So the objectives of this particular project were to first create evidence on patterns of mobile phone access and use by low-income women. And the second was to identify the barriers that these women are facing in accessing and using mobile phones. Next slide, please. Now that was the key project of the findings of which we're going to discuss, but we're also going to have kind of 2 other projects from which we're going to present findings. The first one, as you see, is a review of global literature and qualitative interviews from 60 low-income women about mobile phone access and use. The second are kind of our gender disaggregated findings from a larger survey that we'd done in 2019 of about 3,000 low-income Indians, wherein we kind of aimed for a 50-50 gender ratio of men and women, but we were not able to achieve that. But the survey was on information privacy and attitudes towards sharing information with different agents. And towards the end of this survey, this presentation, we're just going to present some of those gender disaggregated findings, because we do see a lot of kind of statistically based evidence for the anecdotes that we've been hearing. So with this, I'll just kind of hand over to my colleague Srikara, who will take us through the findings of the key study that I've been talking about.
Thanks, Anubhatie. Hello, everyone. So I'll just start off by giving a little more context about the study we undertook on gender. So after hearing so much about the anecdotal evidence on the difficulties that women were facing, especially in rural parts of India, remote regions of India, we wanted to really understand what this looks like and if it has already been captured in other research projects. So we first undertook a literature review that was initially aimed only at India, but then we had to widen that to look at literature from the global south, because there was very, very little, or actually no evidence that was specific to how women in India use mobile phones. We picked the year 2016 as a cutoff, and that was primarily because that was the year, as Anubhatie was saying, when digitization really kicked off and Geo came into the market. And I think just based on our conversations, we know how Geo changed affordability and access to mobile phones and internet in general. So to present some learnings from that study, yeah. So if we synthesize all the literature about how women access, use, or even own mobile phones, I think the 6 key trends that come out is that women usually use somebody else's mobile phone. They do not have their own mobile phone. So it's a shared mobile phone in the household that she might use with maybe her husband or some other person in the household. Even if they do own a mobile phone, it's usually cheaper or has an older phone. So when we, in a world where we're using a lot of smartphones, I think women are more likely to be using second-hand phones or feature phones. In cases where mobile phones are shared, we found that the access or control over that mobile phone is usually with the man or the elder men in the household. Women tend to use lesser services, lesser features on the phone, fewer advanced features on the phone. So one trend over there is that women are less likely to use internet services. They might limit themselves to, say, mobile making or receiving calls from very specific people again. And I think the 5th insight is about how women are more likely to use mobile phones at home. This might not be very surprising given that a lot of women-led occupations in rural communities are based out of home, or in some cases when they're not occupied, they stay at home as maybe housewives or similar occupations. And lastly, that they're less likely to use internet or the phone. I'm sorry about the background noise. It's just a train going by. Yeah. So we also looked at how women engage with digital financial. I'm sorry, I'll just take a. Okay. Yeah, we also looked at evidence on how women use digital financial services, and unsurprisingly, a lot of this is coming just from Africa, given the high amounts of digitization they've had, maybe with M-Pesa or M-Shwari and similar services. So the insights that we got over here is that the women tend to adopt more digital financial services when they are in control of the household finances or their own finances, and when they run their own businesses. Otherwise, it's usually other members of the household, maybe the elders in the household or the men in the household that tend to control the finances. And second, although it's easy for women to access mobile money services in the African context, mainly with, I think the study focused on M-Pesa, women found it difficult to use the different services that M-Pesa itself offered. So maybe they were able to navigate the app, maybe they were able to make very basic transactions, but I think the more advanced ones were difficult to use. And from the literature survey, I think the big barriers that we were able to understand that women face in accessing and using mobile phones are just these 6. I'm sorry. Is the two, I mean, you can just categorize them into 2 barriers. One is just physical, and these barriers could be applicable maybe throughout the global south when it comes to being able to afford mobile phones, afford topping up mobile phones, accessing electricity for, just recharging mobile phones, and also trying to understand mobile phone interfaces. So limited literacy and digital literacy do come up and pose significant capability issues. The second category of socio-cultural barriers, I think, again, coming from the global south, it might be applicable to similarly situated countries, but the 3 big ones is just how patriarchal notions that are already existing in society tend to also seep into how women use mobile phones. So, and I will speak about this more later when I narrow down into what we found in our own study on this topic. The second big barrier, I think, is also that the women themselves and also families are concerned about what would happen to women's safety if they went online, maybe in terms of the harassment they might suffer, or just in terms of social humiliation that a family might face, that, woman of a household is, to put it simply, putting herself out there on a digitally open platform. I think it's, again, coming from a notion of honor, family honor, things like that. And lastly, that just the notion that, why do women need mobile phones? It's again, just a question about why women need to exercise their agency when it comes to digital technology. So having known these insights from, I think, the global south, we wanted to do a similar, we wanted to understand if this applies to the Indian context as well. So we wanted to do a study, actually a significantly large study that we wanted to do, but that had to be changed because of the pandemic. So we limited ourselves to a qualitative interview with 60 low-income women in 6 states across India. So to just name them, I think it's Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. So I think this demography kind of covers a very large swath of the Indian population in terms of maybe demographic features, literacy, technological development, income, etc. All the 60 women that we interviewed were customers of DVARA KGFS. So as Anubhuti was saying earlier, a lot of companies in DVARA Holdings focus on providing microfinance services to in remote rural areas. And DVARA KGFS is, I think, it's one of the most deeply networked entity with like very deep presence on in rural areas, which provides financial services. And they had recently also started offering digital financial services. So maybe collecting repayments via mobile phones, communicating via mobile phones, making payments, etc. So we had partnered with them to reach out to their own customers and understand what women are, how women are using mobile phones. So yeah, there were 3 things that we try to understand on this front: is how do these women access mobile phones, how do they use mobile phones, and what are the barriers that they're facing. We wanted to focus these interviews on mobile phones at large because, again, there was very scant evidence already available on how women use mobile phones. So we thought that would be the logical first step before asking directly about how they use digital financial services. Although there was one tiny section on how women use payment applications or basic digital financial services, which I'll also come to. Yeah, so the demography of this study is that all the women were middle-aged, I'd say younger middle-aged, 21 to 49 years. Most of them were educated at least until the secondary level, that's 10 to 12 standard. Most of them could read in vernacular, and they could read basic message communications in English. All the women were married and most of them had children, half lived in joint households. One significant, I think, difference from one important characteristic is that all of them mostly used smartphones. And that's not usually a trend that we saw in our global survey of literature. So that's probably a outlying factor here. And a majority of the women that we spoke to were working in different occupations, like maybe some of them were farm workers, some of them were tailors, some of them had retail businesses. And a lot of them worked in part-time capacity from home, which is, again, an important characteristic to contextualize the study. Just 2 limitations on this front is that this is a very small sample size. It's only about 60 women, although they're spread across different states. And they also represent, I think, rural, semi-urban, and urban areas. So it's a significant curve, but it's only a very small sample. And the other big difference is that considering these women were already customers of a digital financial service provider, they might have some comfort, some amount of agency and discipline that comes with using financial services and mobile phones. So again, that's important to consider because a lot of women in India right now are yet to use financial services, or yet to use digital services, are still very large in amount. So yeah, with that, just diving into the insights. In terms of access and ownership, as I was saying earlier, all of the women have access to mobile phones, and most of them own mobile phones, which are usually smartphones. And again, as an outlier, a lot of these women purchased the mobile phones themselves or were gifted a handset. And they were also able to afford, about around half of them, so around 30 of them were able to afford purchasing top-ups on their own or jointly with their husband. These are all I think there are significant outliers from what we saw in the global literature, but again, that's because of the sample that we spoke to. In terms of use patterns, I think this is where we find a lot more insights coming out about how low-income women in India are using mobile phones. So a lot of them use their mobile phones a few times a day, and usually to make calls. And those calls are primarily with either their own family or very few. I mean, if it's for a social purpose, it was to their family or to their husband's family, but very rarely to friends. And if it was for a business purpose, I think they did so, I think at least once a week to make sure to make business decisions. And messaging, I think this is one significant insight is coming out, is that women tended to use WhatsApp a lot more than conventional messaging services. So that might say something about increased access to internet services, availability of WhatsApp on, um, light versions of WhatsApp on even basic phones that might not require significant input. And also maybe just the fact that WhatsApp is a free service, so to say. We do not inquire too much into that. In terms of payment applications, I think it's kind of interesting in this case is, sorry, one second, yeah. Almost a little less than half, so about 27 or 28 of the women said they use applications like Google Pay, Paytm, and PhonePe. So it might be through UPI or wallets or any of the other methods that, again, we do not inquire into at this stage. Yeah, and naturally, considering how all of these applications work only on smartphones, none of the basic phone users were able to use digital payment services. Now I think there are one or two services that work even on basic phones, like say USSD-based payments, but there was no report on using those services. We did not see any significant change in how women in different states were using mobile payment applications. I think women in all the 6 states who had smartphones reported using mobile payments. But what's interesting is that women with higher education were more likely to use mobile payment applications. And it was a significant difference. I think about all of the women who had university level education were using smartphones, but then that number kind of halved when we consider women who are only educated maybe until secondary level. So that might go to suggest a hypothesis about a link between education and use of smartphones or mobile payment applications in this case. Sorry, yeah. And I was also talking to you earlier about some other basic financial services over the phone, and that's essentially whether women receive OTPs for making financial transactions or information about their financial transactions on their phone. So around more than half of them used their own mobile numbers to receive OTPs from their phone. And again, respondents with higher levels of education were likely to use this more. One significant, again, sociocultural dimension here is that husbands of women tended to receive OTPs on their behalf. In this study, we noticed it in a few cases, but our learnings from the Global Literature Review was that it's more often than we think. This could be just because the husband has control over the joint bank account, or that they've provided their number, or if it's a shared mobile phone, it's their number. But there is a trend where husbands tend to receive important authentication information or just information about important for agency. We also found some significant insights on how women learn how to use their phone. A lot of them in this study taught themselves how to use their phone. They don't really have they either taught themselves or learned it from their children. They don't have a formal source of learning how to use their phones or a proper person who they can approach to learn how to use their phones. And women tend to spend a significant amount of time learning how to do this. And that might also be a significant barrier, considering that they do need to spend a lot of time on other activities that they're expected to, just in terms of household work or business occupation or however it goes. So this lack of knowledge that they have is a major impediment in how they use their mobile phone for more advanced tasks, including for payment services or digital financial services. It's one interesting insight that we got is that the way women navigate phones is either by reading in vernacular, or if that's not available, they use visual cues such as the logos of applications, logos of services, or they just memorize the steps to go to different applications and use them. So with those findings on from global literature and as a study, I'll just hand it back to Anubhuti to talk about the constraints that we can learn about from both these projects.
Thank you so much, Srikar. As we discussed in the beginning, we did do an information privacy survey, which was a large-scale primary survey of, we wanted to target about 3,000 low-income Indians, but after kind of data cleaning, we came to about 27, a sample size of 2,700. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as I said, the survey was not exactly focused on mobile phone use patterns, but we did, but rather on information privacy and how Indians perceive the sharing of their and transacting of their personal information with different actors. But as part of the survey, we did ask a couple of questions about where are the moments where they are transacting their personal data. And therefore, in this particular slide, for instance, we're seeing the disparity in use of different digital payment modes. So here the questionnaire instrument was asking the respondents as to whether or not they had experienced or had a previous experience of undertaking any of these activities. So we had a couple of sections. One was on, say, using of entertainment apps. One was on using services apps. This particular section was on the usage of digital payments. So we asked them if they ever had an experience using an ATM card, whether they had an experience of using net banking either to send money or to receive money, and then whether they had the experience of using a mobile wallet such as Paytm or Bheem. So Bheem obviously is not a mobile wallet, but it is still a mobile transacting application. So we did group them together. And as you will see, overall, between both men and women, the overall, the highest usage of any kind of digital payment is an ATM card or a debit card, which in some sense is also not as digital a mode of payment as we would consider the others. However, we could understand the high usage of ATM cards due to the creation of bank accounts, wherein a lot of cases, a debit card or the ATM card is a default kind of offering by the bank. And it is somewhat easy for most users to understand, either to use at a point of service where they can just hand over their debit card to a merchant and then undertake the transaction, or go to an ATM to withdraw money. So we see close to 33%, we see close to 33% of male respondents having reported using an ATM card, but only close to 20% of women who use ATM cards. As we move to kind of more sophisticated ways of digital payments, such as net banking and mobile payments, we see that there is a second highest usership from our respondent base to use net banking for sending money. And then that number kind of decreases when it goes to receiving money. So it would appear that while using our questionnaire instrument, our enumerators could have cited examples of using like a mobile application to send money. So over the years, even though while we were making the questionnaire, we meant net banking to be purely the application of, that is an offering of their bank itself, it could have been confused for UPI, etc. But we do see again that there is a higher percentage of male respondents than female respondents using net banking, both in the cases of sending money and receiving money. And finally, when it comes to the usage of mobile wallets such as Paytm, this does have the lowest kind of usership, at least amongst our respondent base, which was somewhat of a surprise to us, because we did think Paytm, etc., were gaining traction amongst all stratas of the population. But again, we see only close to, say, 15% of our respondent base having used mobile wallets. And again, in that, while there is about 11%, 11.5% male respondents using mobile wallets, very little, only 3.5% of women who are using these mobile wallets. So across the board, we see that female respondents tend to use or are unable to use digital payments to the same extent as their male counterparts. Next slide, please. Now, here we're talking about the disparity in the access and ownership of mobile phones themselves. So here in the questionnaire instrument, the question that was asked was two-part. First, we asked them if they knew how to use either a feature phone and a smartphone. And when we talk about a feature phone, we're talking about a phone that is non-touch screen, so uses buttons to kind of operate. And the second part of the question was whether they owned a smartphone or a feature phone. The rationale behind this two-part question was that we, as Srikara said, we already know from a lot of literature that mobile devices are often shared. Sometimes they are not just shared within the family, but also shared within amongst, say, social groups. So say between two friends. So one might know how to use a particular device, but may not have ownership of it. So when we just talk about ownership, we see that there is a higher ownership of feature phones than there is of smartphones. This could also be explained by the strata that we were investigating, which is the low income individuals. But if you just kind of look at the gender disaggregated data within feature phones, we see that more female respondents reported having a feature phone than male respondents. Whereas in the case of smartphones, even though the overall kind of ownership of smartphones within the strata is lower than feature phones, we see that more male respondents have ownership of smartphones than female respondents do. Next slide, please. Then this was the question about the knowledge of using either a feature phone or a smartphone. Again, more respondents reported knowing how to use a feature phone than a smartphone. This could again be rationalized by saying that within a social group or a social setting, they do have, like this particular income group might have access to a feature phone more easily than they would to a smartphone, which could probably explain the absolute numbers. But within a feature phone, we see that more male respondents have the knowledge of using a feature phone than female respondents do, although it is rather equal. It's about 46% approximately, and 44% for male and female respondents respectively. But when it comes to the smartphone, again, there is definitely somewhat of a disparity. We see that 34.5% of male respondents had the knowledge of using a smartphone than female counterparts, wherein only 23% of the female respondents knew how to use a smartphone. So what we're trying to show by these numbers is that all of these findings really kind of corroborate to what we've been seeing from our qualitative interviews as well, which is to say that there is a very clear disparity in the access to mobile devices by female respondents in the case of the study, but also the female population in general. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a summary of the findings from the same survey, where we also had a section about gender perspectives on the usage of mobile phones by women, but also a couple of other field studies and interviews that we've been conducting. So the first is the location of use. So first of all, it's obviously deemed unnecessary for women to be using a mobile phone, but when they do, they primarily use it inside their homes. Often it is either their male child's or their brother's or their father's mobile device. Very few of them are even allowed to take a phone outside, and even if they do, it's only for emergencies. Then there is a lot of monitoring and surveillance. Even while using a mobile device within the household, they are constantly monitored either by their husband or by their in-laws, and sometimes even by, say, external male family members who happen to be within the household. Then control by the husband. This was something that Srikara spoke about. So mostly it is the male head of the household, usually the husband, who has control over the household finances, and mobile phones reduce women's ability to use mobile payments in that case, because first, even if they wanted to, they'd have to be heavily reliant on their husband for all of the kind of supporting information that would require facilitating a digital payment. So even if they wanted to set up, say, a UPI account, which requires them to have a mobile device, have information about their bank account to set up that account, it is likely that the bank account information is also held by the husband. in which case they'd have to rely on them for setting up that account. And finally, there is a very high fear of online harassment and fear of harm, both from bystanders and by women themselves. So we also did kind of a qualitative study back in 2017, which was called Privacy on the Line, wherein we asked very few, I mean, the sample size was rather small, but it was a very deep kind of conversation with each of these respondents about how they use mobile phones. And from that study, but also from the kind of primary study that I'm talking about now, women respondents did say that using a mobile phone is rather risky, or sharing photos or personal information on mobile phones over mobile apps or social networking apps is scary. It's risky because they stand at a risk of harm from strangers, or they fear that their photos or information could be misused, or they could be bothered by kind of unsolicited calls, etc. So that is a rather major deterrent for women themselves wanting to take up a mobile phone device. And obviously, we add to that the kind of the same fear that stands with the family members in not wanting to give them a mobile device. So these are the social, cultural constraints, and with this we're kind of ending our findings section of the presentation, and I'll just hand back to Srikara, and he can take us through through the like kind of research questions and thoughts that we can think about from these findings.
Thanks, Anubhuti. So I think one thing that's clear, coming out clearly from all of these studies, is that there's a major disparity between how women and men can access and use mobile phones. It's not just about whether they have access or not. So in that sense, I think the key takeaways for researchers, for providers and policymakers, I think fourfold. And before I go there, I think it's very important to say that this was, I think, among the first, if not the first, study that focused so much on understanding how women in rural India or low-income women kind of use mobile phones for different purposes. So it's a small study, so it sets up a foundation for larger studies. But I think just if there are if some studies are able to validate some of these findings, I think doing larger, more empirical studies might actually reflect these at a larger scale. I think so. That's the first point, that there's a need for more and better data to understand the patterns of how women use mobile phones, and then about how they use digital financial services. And again, this is very significant because most of the digital financial revolution, I should say, in India is being propelled through mobile phones, either through UPI-based applications or through other mobile applications. So understanding these patterns becomes really clear, really important. The second one is that you can't design a service assuming that it would be equally accessible to or equally usable by both men and women. You need to pay very deliberate attention to the differences in capabilities and accessibility that between women and men. And the third one is that you need to account for the fact that in a lot of cases, women might not have control over their mobile phone or their finances. So how do you circumvent, or how do you factor in that challenge that women might face in using services? And then I think the last one is also something that Anubhuti said in the constraints section, is that when women face constraints on where they can use their mobile phones, when they can use it, and for what purposes, I think that's an automatic, it's a significant barrier to what women use their mobile phones for. And if you had to design digital financial services that seemingly can empower women, how do you overcome these social barriers that step in? So it's, on one stage, it's just technical barriers like the design of it or to understand the capabilities, and on the second aspect, it's a larger socio-cultural challenge to tackle before we can assume that digital financial services will be accessible for everyone, will make a change everywhere. So yeah, I think the significant questions for research that come up are really to understand all of these constraints, all of these use patterns at a larger scale. So how do women use and access mobile phones in different contexts? And we say different contexts because we do know from intersection analyses that women in different communities face different kind of constraints, different kind of limitations on what they can do with technology or even otherwise. So what do those barriers look like, and how do use patterns in those cases look like? And again, what are the barriers that women face and how do they negotiate with them? And the third one is really on the technical, third and fourth one, really on a technical side. How do you make mobile phone applications? How do you make digital financial services more women user friendly, more friendly for customers with limited digital literacy, which is, frankly, not just a gender problem, but I think more largely when there is low literacy or limited digital literacy, how do you design for those contexts? And yeah, how can these constraints really be mitigated? What are the different ways? And these are the four big questions that we hope resonate with you and leads to some more work on this at a larger scale. And with that, we conclude our presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I might just
happy to take any questions.
If we just stop the screen share, and then I'll be able to see who's got their hand up, and we'll see if we can take some questions. Okay, great. Pradeep, I can see, perhaps because you're in the top row. Pradeep, why don't you go first?
Right. Anubhatie and Srikara, that's a fascinating presentation. I think you've brought us down to earth. We've been talking about platforms and high-level things and policy and all the rest of it, and suddenly kind of you guys deal with how people access these things and use them and the disparities there, et cetera, et cetera. So you probably have come across Asa Doran's work, on mobile phone connectivity in India. She did some work, I think it was among these boat people in Varanasi or Benares or somewhere, and their wives, right? And there were, stories about, narrate stories about how, when a newly married, bride comes into the household, the mother-in-law takes over the phone, and basically, that's the end of that girl's independence, because the phone gave her some kind of independence previously before she was married, kind of stuff, and that goes. One of my friends, Shanmugavel, who did his PhD on laborers in agricultural laborers in South India, has told me about how, just because they own a phone, it does not mean that they can, ring up the landlord and say, I'm not coming today, because caste etiquette plays a major role, right? So basically the phone has been domesticated, right? So caste has taken over the phone in some ways in that context, right? So the question I had for you guys was, your kind of research does show some kind of use of these phones by women, right? There is use of these phones by women. Now, in kind of, feminist literature, whatever, we talk about women's empowerment and these kinds of things, right? These big words, right? Like empowerment and stuff like that. Would you say that there is a level of agency here when women actually use those phones, right? Are they kind of, is there a kind of understanding of agency there of women being in somewhat ways, you may not want to call it empowered, but they have the space to use that phone and they are the stronger for it, kind of thing. Do you get that feeling in your work, or are these, or do you feel that, there's nothing like that? There's no kind of, access is, it's only for functional purposes. It's very limited, etc.
I can take that, Srikar, if you don't mind. Yeah. So I'm just going to kind of present both my personal and the view that we've seen from research. So just in the process of doing all these studies, we have been speaking to a lot of kind of women groups, as well as a lot of women at the very kind of low income strata. And when we talk about agency from these devices, I personally don't think a lot of it is being provided, I think the women in general have to be very strong figures, and then therefore, they become kind of the talking point of that particular local society, that, oh my God, she's just like that. And therefore, her usage of that mobile phone becomes okay because she's kind of dared to exercise her agency by using that mobile phone. But in most cases, I think you're right in saying that the usage of mobile phone is highly, highly functional. It's only limited to kind of the very immediate use that exists. So in the case of a feature phone, for instance, that's only being given to a girl because she might be probably going to a college and her parents do want to keep kind of track her movements and be able to call her up at any point of time. So even though that young girl owns a mobile phone, there is no semblance of agency that's coming from her using that mobile phone. Then just I think I'd like to point out to something that Srikar had said, which was that it so happens that educated women tend to have mobile phones more than their uneducated or illiterate counterparts. And here again, when we talk about usage by women about mobile phones, it's two ways. Either it's very rote in the sense that they know that these are the buttons they have to press in order to kind of send a voice note to communicate, and there is no exploration of that mobile device beyond that. They either don't want to or they don't feel confident enough to. And in the case where they do have kind of more expanded usage of that mobile phone device, again, it's very purposive in the sense that they want to kind of be clear to themselves that they're using a mobile phone only because they have an enterprise to run and only because they need to kind of coordinate with people who help them run their business, etc. But I personally would not say that any kind of agency is really being provided by the mobile device. And I just end by kind of this one conversation that I had with a digital literacy trainer at a small finance bank in India called Mandeshi. They run a digital literacy program wherein they literally go from village to village in Maharashtra, and they train women on how to use a mobile device on different kind of usages for making digital payments, for inquiring information, for setting up a bank account. And even in that, they have a great digital literacy person called Rupali Shinde, who tells us that their first job every time they go to a village is actually first convincing the in-laws and the husbands to let their kind of wives and daughter-in-laws and daughters to enroll in this program, because there is such high kind of barrier in them even sending their kind of female family members for a program like this, because they're afraid of the kind of agency that's going to provide to them. So, Shikar, if there's anything to add, please do.
I think it does. It's very striking when we've been talking about the urban environment where there's near saturation in the ownership of phones, where there's a large scale uptake in these services, that you can use them everywhere, down to 15%. That's for both genders, and then even lower for women. It just goes to show the gap, the kind of rural metro gap when it comes to these things. I wondered whether you were able. I mean, you probably would have mentioned it if you'd had it, but whether you were able to kind of examine the extent to which people were using not just payments but perhaps savings facilities through phones, because of I remember with demonetization, a lot of women appeared with cash that they'd had away for their kids' education, or money that they were holding on to because they didn't have bank accounts, and that money went into the banking system. But is access to kind of savings as well as payments kind of increasing through phones? Is that being taken up? Did anybody talk about that?
Can I take this? Yeah, so I think early on when demonetization first happened, there was some significant disruption in this space. I think a lot of NBFCs, a lot of banks had a lot of difficulty in ensuring that those deposits really continue, because there was no availability of cash, and back then digital financial services weren't really in trend, if I can say so. But I think now that I can't. There are a lot of NBFCs and banks that are trialing with digital financial services at the last mile. And there is, just from our conversations with some of these providers, we see that some women, users in general, not just women, they did take up, like the take up of digital options had increased, especially during the pandemic. But it's difficult to say that it's difficult to say this is actually a rising trend because there are also offline business correspondent agents who sometimes go to the doorstep of customers or who have branches very close to customers who might still want to prefer paying in cash. Sorry again. And one big reason for that is because I don't know, I think all the factors that we discussed so far and just the trust level in making digital payments, I think all of these play a role. So I don't think we can conclusively say that it's a trend that's here to stay or that there's a major, there is definitely a major shift, but we don't know how long that will last.
I mean, and did you get a sense from your survey work of the gender division between what people are making payments for? You know, whether they're paying, you know, I mean, obviously not in the larger survey, but in the urban environment, perhaps paying for domestic help, running household expenses, education expenses, etc., or the extent to which people are perhaps receiving money, you know, for work through. I've noticed in some places I've been that some of these payment services are being used to kind of pay people in these small local economies for work that they're doing, and whether you see much evidence of that taking hold.
I mean, I think
that's two questions.
Yeah, that's why I think there's definitely a rise in how people are making retail payments, maybe at local stores or just between two individuals, because as we presented earlier on, there are about 4,723 million digital transactions happening right now. And I think UPI is leading the charge on that. I think the rise in UPI transactions was, I don't know, 67% again compared to just last year and this year. And UPI is usually a retail payment thing. It's not options that merchants used to trade with each other or governments used to make transactions. So those transactions are definitely booming. But again, the concern here is that these figures may be limited to urban, peri-urban areas, which are leading the UPI charge. We don't really know if rural, like truly rural areas are seeing the same, are contributing to these numbers significantly. It's a little difficult to know this because again, these figures are not disaggregated by region. We might know soon because the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, plans to come out with a digital payments inclusion index, which would cover all of these aspects, who's using payments, which regions, etc. But at this stage, it's a little difficult to conclusively say that it's a pan-Indian trend.
Does anybody have any other questions?
I had a quick question. So, Srikara and Anubhatie, when you were talking about the sphere of agency, I was wondering whether it extended sphere of agency of women, whether it extended outside of the household to the community, because you read about the local panchayats, khap panchayats passing these things saying that women, you know, there's a moral problem and we don't want women to use. So in your work, did you come across this kind of sphere of agency moving beyond just the family itself to the people who have authority in the locality or panchayats, etc.?
Shekhar, I think you can take it when you talk about kind of Leena's findings. But I think from the information privacy survey, where we had a section on women's perceptions, at least it was a very typical survey problem. So we were not able to gauge whether this kind of fear of agency was extended to the community itself, because there was a huge kind of social likability problem within the respondents. So there were still significant numbers of people who said that they did not want, or they did not think it was necessary for women to be using mobile phones for any of the users. We kind of asked them about different users. But from that particular survey, we were not able to tell. We obviously know from Anya Kovac's work about khap panchayat in Uttar Pradesh, where they don't want them to be using mobile phones. So that is definitely one piece of work that still stands to kind of say that. But I think this is kind of outside the kind of purview of this particular discussion, perhaps, but I think Sonia Falero's book called The Ordinary Girls, this was regarding the kind of rape incident that had taken place in Uttar Pradesh in 2016, was also instigated by the fact that those two young girls were kind of using mobile phones. So, there are kind of like these social kind of blips that take place. There are almost kind of warning signs to show that, maybe agency for you is not the best thing to come across. And Srikara, if there are any findings from Lena, because I remember her having something about this.
Yeah, I think when we talk about agency, I think there's a general social tendency to just to limit how much agency women have with their mobile phones, because earlier on in the slides we were presenting something on monitoring and surveillance. The trend over there was so disturbing that in some cases boyfriends of women, for instance, installed surveillance applications on the mobile phone to make sure they know everything that the girlfriend in this case did. And in general, I think there is a fear, apart from the fear of harm that might be caused, just a chilling effect about what other members in the society would think that I, as a woman, would be using, say, a mobile phone, or more specifically, as a woman, would use Facebook or social media, where I can voice my opinions more openly compared to maybe in a physical setting. So I think apart from what Anubhuti said about khap panchayats, etc., already having rules, I think there's also just a larger systemic stigma against this that's limiting agency. Yeah.
Do we have another question? I think we've got time for a couple of quick questions. I noticed that Srikara has posted some links here in the chat. If you guys want to follow those up later, which give links right through to to a video series on some of the actual field work and a blog actually on the study of mobile-based financial services, particularly for migrant groups and migrant labourers who've been such an important group. And of course, especially we've seen the disruption in their lives over the past year and a half. So it'll be interesting to see the extent to which having mobility helped alleviate some of the exodus of migrant workers in labour during the pandemic. And a series of studies on the gender gap. So there are 3 hyperlinks there, which I'd encourage everybody to go and have a look at, because I think I get the sense there's really a lot more data, and also particularly those qualitative studies that you talked about were really interesting to kind of engage with those, because I'm sure there's going to be some really interesting insights in there. So there's a lot of information there for everyone to follow up with. Does anybody have any other thoughts?
I don't have any thoughts, but I just wanted to thank, is it Srikara and Anubhuti for their presentation. I mean, the data is so fascinating, and it kind of, proves the point about India, that is, sometimes we just see only the top 10 or 15% of what is going on and think, oh my God, India is going, places. And then other times when you come across this kind of data, you kind of go, oh my God, we have a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to begin to, part of this is that question of legibility we talked about a lot yesterday. I think that some of these kind of patterns that become apparent with digital transactions start to give you a much more kind of a firmer sense of these disparities across region to region, between genders, across social classes, and what people. You can have data on how long people spend on platforms, which platforms, what do they spend. I was looking at that on a gendered basis, and you can see that the spending capacity, it's like an 80-20 split, which kind of shows you immediately who's really in control of the disposable income. That doesn't mean they're spending on themselves, but you can certainly see that works. But you can't disaggregate that down to a district level or between regions or in any way that would actually allow you to account for that diversity. That's just a kind of national whole, because that's generally the data that the kind of finance platforms collect. So I think this is somewhere where researchers make a really kind of tangible contribution, especially in terms of those larger goals that DVARA are talking about, which is actually designing applications that make sense, And I think also, going back to the era of demonetization, again, it's the question, if you're a daily laborer and you're spending what you earn every day almost entirely on your needs for that day, what are the needs for the kinds of, why do you need a mobile wallet to store things? Why do you want to route things through 3 things if you need it right now? But you know, the long-term thinkers, you know, in the family are the people who might well have in services that they might want to need, they might need over the long term, and there might be ways of designing those kinds of applications once you have people's needs in mind. So I think that that's kind of, and also part of what I was saying yesterday, I think about, you know, the idea of a unique idea, a unique individual, a unique user, which is so baked into digital culture.
Yeah.
But then when you look into family finances and you find that people are sharing phones, you know, people are sharing bank accounts, somebody's putting their business in their wife's account, they're using somebody else's account, it's, you know, then actually the picture becomes much more complex. That doesn't mean, you know, so in that sense, there's a way about thinking of the actually existing use of these apps rather than just the kind of uptake number, in terms of thinking about the impact upon people's, you know, kind of agency and enablement to do things that they couldn't do before. And also, I suppose, the extent to which, I mean, what also interests me is the extent to which we think about this not in a void. So there are lots and lots of existing financial services and credit systems across India, some of them hundreds or thousands of years old. They're still operating, they're still available. So there's not like these financial systems are going into a black hole of development where there's never been, you know, there's never been a financial service. There are other ways of doing these things, which have their benefits and their limitations as well. So it's trying to think about that kind of holistically, as Pradeep was saying. So I think, you know, this kind of empirical research is really, really, you know, critical and really, really useful, and also very commendable to be doing under the conditions that you've been doing it in over the last year and a half. When I think, you know, it's just, I think we've found it almost impossible to do any empirical research, you know, for one reason or another in amongst this. So it's really shows some dedication as well as skill. So I think I should thank you on everybody's collective behalf, and thank you for taking time to come and share it with us all here today.
It's our pleasure, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let's have